So in this video, I'm going to take a look here at some of the influences of Hellenism upon Jews living in Palestine, well, really upon Jews living throughout the diaspora, even outside of Palestine. I'm going to just focus here particularly on the government, citizenship, and then begin to look at some of the distinctions between generally this Greek, sometimes called the Greek spirit, and how that compares to kind of Semitic culture. Then look at the ways in which some Jews sought to respond to this influence of Hellenistic culture upon them. So here we begin, first of all, by the kind of the government that's brought in. So after Alexander the Great wins over the Persians and takes over the area of Judea, the area of Palestine. Some of the things that we'll note here is particularly within Greece, you had a focus more on cities because the ideal, and amongst some of the philosophers, was the ideal life is lived in the city, and so areas are kind of divided up into city states. And in Greece, what you would have is typically amongst these city states, there would have been a king, and these kings would have had some kind of absolute power. So this is kind of a background to the way in which the Greek culture was at the time or just prior to the time with Alexander the Great. So you also had within these cities, and a focus on the cities, is a council known as a boule. And a boule is made up either of all citizens or usually some kind of elective representatives who will then deal with issues that confront life in the city-state. So this concept of organizing areas, territories around cities is an important introduction, because so now you'll have Jerusalem as a city, and things that happen in that city are then what's going to determine how that territory is going to function. So you have a council. Well, what's going to happen eventually is there will be a council set up of Jews in Jerusalem. This council we know of as the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is made up primarily the ruling class, if we can call them that, but it's primarily made up of priests and also members of the aristocracy or the kind of leading families who are going to participate in making judgments. So, of course, at the time that Jesus lived, this Sanhedrin has to be answerable to a Roman, procurator, Pontius Pilate. But with Hellenism is this focus on city life and the functioning of the city, because the health of the functioning of the city is going to then translate into how the territory is going to be run. So we do see at the time of Jesus an increase of constructions of cities in areas like in Galilee, because as these cities are constructed, it's in these cities that members of the aristocracy who's going to end up buying up land are going to live, and they're going to administer the territories from these cities. So city-state government, or cities being the focal point of Hellenistic life, is very characteristic of the way in which Hellenism influenced the regions that they took over. Now, when it comes to citizenship in a city, well, it's primarily urban. I mean, a citizen is someone who lives in a city, and so it has that urban focus. Typically, citizenship belonged to native Greeks and also to upper class foreigners. So upper class foreigners, wealthy, members of the aristocracies, wealthy individuals could become citizens. You also had in each city the marketplace, what's known as the agora. and that's the center of kind of political, religious, and commercial activities. Now, as cities were being constructed in Palestine, having an agora could be something that they could put in there, which again indicates Hellenistic influence. Some cities had already been built long before the rise of Hellenism, so modifications had to take place. So, what we see, for instance, is the temple in Jerusalem gets expanded by Herod the Great to include a marketplace. And so, where all kinds of buying and selling can take place. And so that may have been what we see with Jesus coming into the temple precinct. The outer court area is something like an agora in Jerusalem. And yet Jesus sees the place outside of the temple as the place where non-Israelites should be able to come and pray to God. And so, of course, he is upset when he sees this area basically like a Greek agora. It's just a typical marketplace. Nothing wrong with having a marketplace, but it shouldn't be there where people are supposed to come and to worship God or pray to God. We also have the gymnasium as a key part of the education and exercise, particularly of boys. So typically it's just boys who were educated, and so the wealthy members would send their sons off to the gymnasium where they would be trained in lots of different disciplines, but also included in reading, writing, um, discussing, debating. Also was exercise, because within the Greek concept, the idea of a healthy body is also indicative for the healthy mind. So this was quite new for Jews. Jews did not really have places for practicing sports. There's not a sports culture as such. So bringing in the gymnasium and the emphasis on athletics as a part of education was new, and there was, of course, some resistance to this activity, particularly because for Greeks, young men exercised in the nude. So that made it possible so that a Jew would be seen whether he's circumcised or not, and circumcision was looked down upon by Greeks. They couldn't understand why that would need to be done. And if there were wealthy Jews who wanted to have their sons attend a Greek education, then they had a problem that they had to address. What do they do about their sons and the state of their circumcision? We find out in the book of First Maccabees that some Jews even decided to have their sons' circumcision reversed so that they could look more like non-Jews when they were being sent to the gymnasium for their education or exercises. So this is something that becomes imposed, and we see that Herod the Great also constructed gymnasiums because Herod wanted to attract non-Jews to the region. He wanted to Hellenize more the area. And so one of the many different building projects he had were gymnasiums. So this is a part of the life of a Hellenistic culture. And rhetoric would have been at the center of education. So not only would young men have been taught about reading and writing, math, but also how to deliver, how to speak, how to argue. So that's a key aspect. And so there are a lot of different theories about how to construct an argument, how to organize one's presentation. And so young men who would go to the gymnasium would be exposed to that. So I want to talk here about the Greek spirit, what sometimes can be called the Greek spirit. So Greek spirit has the primary virtues are harmony, wisdom, courage, temperance, endurance, and justice. So these values, these virtues are kind of central to this idea. So to promote harmonious living, what's called wisdom, can be more speculative than it is when you think about just, maybe what we might call practical wisdom, day-to-day life type of wisdom. Wisdom is exploring even abstract ideas. Of course, courage is an important thing, especially for young men, to be courageous, to be willing to fight. It's tied up with their concept of masculinity. Temperance is this idea of showing restraint, control over one's appetites, desires. So you don't just give to yourself to any whims that you might have, but you try to maintain balance in the things that you enjoy and the things that you do, knowing that excess can lead to destruction or lack of harmony or chaos. Endurance, so this idea of persistence and the idea of justice. What is the right thing to do? So life is dominated by fate. So in other words, people's lives are kind of determined, as it were, by the gods or by whatever powers there might be. And for many within Hellenistic culture, the meaning of life is to avoid pain and unhappiness. So what do you have to do in order to do those things? How do you live in a way so that you don't experience pain or unhappiness? Epicurean philosophy, one of the many philosophies that existed at the time, stressed freedom and pleasure, but don't get Epicurean philosophy confused with hedonism, where in hedonism one just lives for pleasure and sets no limits. Epicurean philosophy understood that if you go into excess, you could encounter pain, and so you could become unhappy. So don't just go after any kind of all the pleasures that you might have. Don't have unrestrained desires. But freedom is an important thing. You want to be free from anything that tries to bring you into service. Now, of course, because they believe in fate, some people are born as slaves. That is their fate. But the idea is that for Greeks in particular, they seek not to be a servant or a slave to anybody, but be able to exercise their freedom to pursue life. And then we also have Stoicism. And so within Stoicism, a very popular belief, this word Stoicism comes from a Greek word, stoa, that has to do with a porch. It was named after the people who debated these ideas on a porch, portico. Stoics stress living in harmony with order. And part of living in order is submitting to what they call the logos. The logos is this power or this force that has organized all of life, and it has determined, as it were, everyone's position and status in life. So the best way to have happiness and the best way to avoid pain is to submit to what the Logos has determined. The Logos is responsible for all of creation, and submitting to the Logos, or recognizing that one has to submit to the Logos and to live with how one's life has been determined, means you can live harmoniously within society, within the world. If you try to resist your fate, then you're going to end up being unhappy. So classical religion really had little impact. In other words, the whole concepts of what we might find amongst Homer's writings, those kinds of gods. It was primarily, though, used for ceremonial purposes. Much like maybe some people today might see Christianity as an ancient religion that they are a part of, but is not something that really has an impact on the decisions that they make on day to day. It's just ceremonies where they get married. It's where they, baptize their children. It's a place where certain holidays they might go to. So classical religion just, yes, the gods are important. Yes, a lot of things are done in association with the gods, but on a day-to-day basis, um, you know, Greeks are looking at other things in order to make determinations on how they live. Mystery religions, which arose as well, were offering saviors, and they were offering relationships with other humans and with the gods. So, but it had secret initiations, and it had secret knowledge about the realities of the world. And one had to be inside the group in order to get exposure to those secrets, to have them revealed to you, and begin to have these more intimate relationships or powerful relationships with the gods, but also creating places for human community. The cultivation of the mind and the body was part of the culture and all religious ceremonies. So mind and body kind of connected here together, although the mind takes precedent over the body. The cultivation of the body is to aid in the cultivation of the mind. And amongst Platonism, which is another part of the Greek spirit, the body is seen as a lower thing. It is only a shadow, as it were, of the reality of the spiritual body that one wants to obtain to. So just a quick little contrast here between a Hellenistic versus maybe a Semitic culture. So again, Hellenistic culture is urban, focused on cities. It's polytheistic, recognizing many different types of gods, very metaphysical, contemplating big, you know, ideas, concepts, um, abstract notions. It's speculative. It likes to raise all kinds of questions and pursue questions that one may not be able to get an answer to, or there's no way of finding a solid answer. It's universal, embraces lots of different peoples, lots of different cultures. It's syncretic. It mixes together Greek ideals with the ideals of other and values of other cultures. And there's a strong emphasis in Hellenistic culture on the individual and what the individual's pursuit. Whereas within Semitic culture, it tends to be more rural and agricultural, life off of the land, producing what one needs off of the land. It is monotheistic. That needs to be kind of qualified a little bit, but basically, for Jews, while there might be other gods, beings, spirits, there's really only one God that they can worship, one God who's responsible for all the other gods, one God who's creator. All other gods would have had some beginning, but Yahweh is the only one that has no beginning, and therefore he is the God who has made this covenant relationship with them. So that is going to rub up against the kind of polytheistic culture of Hellenism, and later on as well within Roman culture. It's also very physical. In other words, it tends to focus more on the realities of what a person does, um, less abstract, very practical as well. What must one do? Kind of more speculative type of questions, the what ifs, trying to define big kind of concepts. That's not as much of the tradition of Semitic culture up to the time that Hellenism arrived. There's a particularism. In other words, Israel is unique. It's not like other cultures. It is distinctive. It's particular. And then also isolation. In other words, we don't want to mix with other nations. We want to maintain our ethnic distinction. They want to maintain, as it were, ethnic distinctiveness. So an identity, and so syncretism is a threat. And so they sometimes would practice distancing, although with Hellenism, it almost becomes virtually impossible to isolate oneself to Hellenism. It is all over. It's going to impact everyone. In one way, we could probably say that in the first century, there's no such thing as a non-Hellenistic Jew. Everybody is influenced, impacted in some way by Hellenism. And in Semitic culture, there's much more emphasis on the community. So, in other words, much of the writings, scriptures, the ideas of how God works in the world, it is through his people, not so much on an individual finding, as it were, what it is that they want, or who they are, or their ideas. It's what the community holds as trustworthy, as faithful, as obedient. So there was lots of different responses to these crises that took place in the 6th and the 4th century BCE. There seems to be this move from the cult to daily life. In other words, more emphasis on how one deals with day-to-day challenges, rather than so much thinking about what do I have to do when I'm at the temple and offering sacrifices, or what do I have to do on other particularly religious, although the distinction between religion and secular is kind of anachronistic for this time. All things are really religious. But the idea of there are certain things that are associated with the faith, that are distinct to the faith, but what is it about life that needs to be done in order to please Yahweh? God cares for devotion in the cult that is extended to devotion that is in daily life. So I can't just appease God with sacrifices. I've got to appease God by the decisions, choices that I make or we make day to day. The study of the law became as important as participation in the cult, because the law of Moses, the law of God delivered through Moses, this is the law that has to do with how one lives daily with one's neighbor, not just what one does when they go to Jerusalem and go into the temple. Jews now gathered in many places to study and discuss, rather than in one place to sacrifice. So we see this rise of the synagogue as a place where, or an assembly where this kind of discussion about the law and what it means and how it applies, all this takes place within the period of Hellenism. And leadership gradually moved from the priesthood. While there's always going to be these high priests who exercise this political authority and authority within the temple, we're going to see a rise of the kind of scholar teacher who's going to have influence out in the country, out in villages, and their interpretation of the law is going to have influence and have impact. We also see this move from kind of what some have called from orthodoxy to orthopraxy. In other words, from knowing the right things to believe to knowing the right things to do. Now, sometimes it's been said that Second Temple Jews are legalistic. So sometimes people, when they're reading the New Testament, they look at opponents, Jewish opponents, and they think that Jews, non-Christian Jews, were just a bunch of legalists, or that Pharisees are legalists. Well, one has to think about what you might mean by that term, legalistic. But Jews did not believe that they were saved because of their obedience to the law. They are saved because, or they have a relationship with God because he graciously brought them into a covenant with him. Now, as a part of that covenant, there is law observance, but one's law observance is not the basis for which one comes into that covenant relationship with God. So to describe Second Temple Jews as legalistic, smacks of something of a kind of anti-Semitism and a misunderstanding and mischaracterization of how Jews typically saw their relationship with God. And part of this as well, this kind of understanding, a kind of renewed understanding of Jewish identity and its relationship to God, it was helped by the work of a scholar by the name of E.P. Sanders, who coined the expression covenantal nomism. This word is made up of the word covenant and then nomism, coming from this word that means law. And so this is this idea that that Jews thought of law observance as an expression of thanksgiving, of gratitude, to belonging to the covenant. So this was a phrase that he coined to try and steer people away from continually to talk about Jews as being legalistic, which is a mischaracterization. And finally, I'm just going to focus here on the growth of particularism. There was an emphasis on ceremonial cleanliness because you're surrounded by non-Jews all the time. Now, non-Jews are moving into the area. They're building their cities. They're taking up land. You can't practice particularism very well. So the question of cleanliness, ceremonial cleanliness, is important. So there became this emphasis on doing things that, particularly in ceremony, that refocus the concept of cleanliness. But one has to remember that not to confuse cleanliness necessarily with sin. Yes, some sins can make one unclean, but people could become unclean, ceremonially unclean, without having sinned. And just because you were unclean didn't mean that you had sinned. I mean, Jesus very likely became unclean in his life because there's lots of things you can do that will make you ceremonially unclean. But just becoming unclean is not really a big issue unless you need to touch something or be engaged in something where cleanliness is important, particularly going to the temple or handling scriptures. So there are a few things that a person should really be self-conscious about whether or not they are clean, and that's why there were so many mikvot or bathing places in Jerusalem, so people could practice washings in order to participate in the temple. But for the most, and we do have mikvahs that have been discovered in Galilee, so there was a concern for practicing ceremonial cleanliness in Galilee. But most of the time, you don't need to worry about it. A Jew wouldn't need to worry about whether or not they were clean unless they were going to touch something or be engaged with something that where that uncleanness could corrupt it. And so there's also a rise of a protectionistic attitude. In other words, what can be done to preserve Israel or preserve the faith? So, for instance, when Pharisees are emphasizing a Sabbath observance, well, I mean, Sabbath observance is one of those things that only Jews did, and one can, emphasize their Jewishness when they try to observe the Sabbath. Now, sometimes there will be Jews who can't practice the Sabbath because they're slaves, or because they work for the Romans, so they don't really have a choice whether or not they can. But for those who can, trying to maintain Sabbath observance what would have been an important thing, as well as obviously circumcision to distinguish a Jew from non-Jews, as well as other things that would have been seen by non-Jews as a particularly Jewish thing. So these kind of practices are important to protect the people, because if you're doing these things, then you are demonstrating to God your faithfulness to his law. And if God sees your faithfulness to his law, then he sees you keeping your end of the covenant, and therefore will respond in turn with the covenant with what his obligations are. So there also becomes this growth of religious distinctiveness. So as I mentioned, the circumcision, Sabbath, kosher observance, all these things begin to grow. And attacks really against these were treated very seriously. So, of course, the Maccabean revolt arose because of charge or the influence to practice idolatry. And Antiochus Epiphanes was banning practices like circumcision and Sabbath and try to make Jews more Hellenized. And so part of the revolt was because these things were threatening, as it were, their identity. So I'm going to leave that there in terms of the influences of Hellenism and Jewish responses to that.